Mic test. Okay, back there. Thank you. I appreciate the introduction. I do indeed work for In-Q-Tel. That's not why I'm here. I'm speaking for myself. I'm obligated to say that every time, of course. Those of you who are entrepreneurs or potential entrepreneurs, we do want to talk to you, just for the record. And we're a particularly good class of investor. I'll sort of let it go at that, but the intelligence community, which is where our funding comes from, expects us to find things, and indeed 60% of the companies we invest in, we found them rather than the other way around. It is not quite like your ordinary VC situation where someone is behind the desk and there's a line of people out the door holding their hat. We're hunter-gatherers, so help us to help you. And also, I appreciate the, how shall I say this in the most diplomatic way? I appreciate the introduction, but in this field, perhaps like no other, the question is, what have you done for me lately? And I encourage you to think that way. Heckling, I don't mind. Go right at it. But what I am trying to get at here is that I can't think of a field that has a greater intellectual challenge than this one. What was true yesterday is not true tomorrow, and vice versa. And furthermore, we have sentient opponents. We don't have stray alpha particles or bad luck. It's a different game. I just read a long article about Boyd, who invented the so-called OODA loop. That's the ideas that we are in. This is more like being a fighter pilot and less like being an industrial planner. I just encourage you to, on days when it seems impossible, to remember that is, in a sense, what makes it good. There's the scene in, what was it, A League of Their Own, where Gina Davis says it's too hard, and the coach says that's why it's great. That applies here, I think, as well. I've found it most fascinating, and in particular, and I suspect that's true in this audience, the fact that people come to it from many other disciplines. I can think of nothing more Renaissance-like than information security. It sort of doesn't matter what your background is, as long as it involved decision-making under uncertainty with strong outcomes. And I don't care whether that's being a civil engineer, why do buildings fall down, whether it's being an attorney. I need to differentiate policy from enforceability, whether it involves biology. If I combine these two genes, does it eat me before I get out the door? I mean, there's any number of fields that are good preparation for this, and I think that we're lucky to have such a mix of people in it. Now I'll do what I really came to do. And by the way, I'll make these comments available to the organizers. But I've gotten to where, how shall I put this? I was trained in public speaking by Reed Buckley. You may not recognize his name, but William F. Buckley was his brother, and you may well recognize that name. And one of the things he said was that if you respect your audience enough, if your audience respects you enough to listen, you should respect them enough to write it out. And so that's indeed what I have done. Reed sadly died about a month ago, and I'm here to honor him in that regard. So, in some sense, in this field, each of us is one of the 12 blind men circled around the elephant. And if that doesn't ring a bell, let it go, but that's exactly where we are. The elephant is like a rope, it is like a tree, it is like a rock. We are at the knee of the curve, I believe, for deployment of a different model of computation. And anytime you're in the knee of a curve, it's hard to tell you're there exactly. It's easy in retrospect, but it's hard at the time. So I'm guessing in that regard. We've had 2 decades where, in round numbers, laboratories gave us twice the computing for constant dollars every 18 months, twice the disk storage capacity for constant dollars every 12, and twice the network speed for constant dollars every 9. That is in the laboratory. That is 2 orders of magnitude for computes per decade, 3 for storage and 4 for bandwidth. In constant dollar terms, that has resulted in our massively enlarging the stored data available per compute cycle. Yet that data is more mobile in the aggregate than it was when there was less of it. It is thus no wonder that cybercrime is data crime. It is no wonder that the advanced persistent threat is the targeted effort to obtain, change, or deny information by means that are difficult to discover, difficult to remove, and difficult to attribute. Yet, as we all know, laboratory results filter out into the commercial off-the-shelf products at rates that are controlled by the market power of existing players. Just because it can be done in a laboratory does not mean that you can buy it today at retail. So it's been with that triad of computation, storage, and transmission capacity. Martin Hilbert, who you might want to look up his work, he described how in 1986 you could fill the world's total storage capacity using the world's total bandwidth in about 2 days. Today, it takes 150 days to fill the world's total storage with the world's total bandwidth. And the measured curve between 1986 and today is all but perfectly exponential. Meanwhile, Moore's law has begun to slow. There are 2 reasons for that. Reason number 1 is physics. We're finding it harder and harder to cool chips at clock rates much beyond what we have now. Reason number 2 is economics. The cost of new fabrication facilities doubles every 2 years, which is Moore's much lesser known second law. Intel canceled Fab 42 in January because the capital cost per gate has begun to climb, and that's important. By 2018, under current trends, one new fab will be just as expensive in inflation-adjusted terms as was the entirety of the Manhattan Project. Hence, the big players either have to get bigger or Moore's first law is over because of Moore's second law. And hardware replacement cycles are no longer driven by consumer upgrade lust, by which I mean the need to buy new hardware just because you need new hardware to run new software. Good enough for everything I need to do pretty much dominates computing, except perhaps in mobile, but that too is a curve that will flatten. Only graphic cards are not yet good enough for everything I need to do, but every curve has its asymptote. In sum, the commercial off-the-shelf market is not going to keep allowing us to dream big without regard to underlying performance costs. We are not going to grow ourselves out of performance troubles of our own making. We were able to do that for a good long run, but that party, I believe, is over. We can see that today in cryptography. In the commercial world, cryptographic performance is now a front and center topic of discussion both in individual firms, amongst expert discussion groups, and within standards bodies. The commercial world has evidently decided that the time really has come to add cryptographic protections to an expanded range of products and services. The question now being unevenly debated is whether, on the one hand, to achieve cryptographic performance with ever more adroit algorithm design, especially design that can make full use of parallelization, or to tend towards more hardware implementations. As you well know, going to hardware yields really substantial gains in performance that are not otherwise possible, but at the cost of zero post-installation flexibility. This is not hypothetical. AES performance improvements have of late been because software has been put aside in favor of hardware. At least in the views of some of us, hardware embodiments make the very idea of so-called algorithm agility operationally irrelevant, because recapitalizing one's data center just so as to get new hardware-based crypto algorithms spliced in is just not going to happen. Nor is turning off some optimized, not to mention amortized, hardware just to be able to use some new software that is consequently 10 times slower. I'm reminded of Donald Knuth's comment, premature optimization is the root of all evil. This brings us to the hardware question in general terms. The embedded system space, already bigger than what is normally thought of as a computer, makes the attack surface of the non-embedded space trivial by comparison. Perhaps I overstate that. Perhaps that is not true today, but by tomorrow it will be true. Quoting an authoritative colleague, that's Peter Gutmann, in the embedded world, which makes the PC and phone and whatnot market seem trivial by comparison, Performance stays constant while cost goes down. 10 years ago, your code had to run on a Cortex-M. 10 years from now, your code will still need to run on more or less the same Cortex-M, only it'll be far cheaper and have many more integrated peripherals. So let me ask a teaser question. If those embedded devices are immortal, are they angelic? Let me first talk, though, about the wider world. Beginning with Stephanie Forrest, actually here in Cambridge in 1997, regular attention has been paid, as was said in the introduction, to the questions of monoculture in the networked environment. There is no point in belaboring the fundamental observation, but let me state it clearly for the record. Cascade failure is very much easier to detonate in a monoculture, so very much easier when an attacker has only to weaponize 1 bit of malware, not 10 million. That idea is obvious. Believing in it is easy. Acting on it and its implications is evidently rather hard. Despite what you might think, I am truly and entirely sympathetic to the actual reason we continue to deploy computing monocultures. Making everything almost entirely alike is and remains our only hope for being able to centrally manage it all in a consistent manner. Put differently, when you deploy a computing monoculture, you're making a fundamental risk management decision. The downside risk of a black swan event is more tolerable than the downside risk of perpetual inconsistency. That is actually a hard question, as all risk management is about changing the future, not explaining the past. So let me repeat, would you rather have the inordinately unlikely event of an inordinately severe impact, or the day-to-day burden of everything being different all the time? When we opt for monocultures by choice, we had better opt for tight central control. This is, of course, supposes that we are willing to face the risks that come with tight central control, including the paramount risk of any and all auto-update schemes, namely the hostile control of the auto-update mechanism itself, irrespective of whether that hostile control is the result of external takeover of a good controller or the result of a previously good controller going over to the dark side. But amongst deployed monocultures, computer desktops are not the point. Embedded systems are. The trend line in the count of critical monocultures seems to be rising, and most of these are embedded systems both without a remote management interface and long-lived. That combination, long-lived and not reachable, is the trend that must be dealt with and possibly even reversed. Whether to insist that embedded devices self-destruct by some predictable age, or that remote management of them be a condition of deployment, is the question, dare I say, the national policy question. That is what is on the table. In either case, the Internet of Things, which is to say the appearance of network-connected microcontrollers in seemingly every device that has a power cord or a fuel tank, should raise hackles on every neck given our current posture. If you want to look at something, I suggest you look at Dan Farmer's work on the so-called Intelligent Platform Management Interface, or IPMI. The last sentence before the conclusion of his paper on that topic, and the reference is in these notes that I'll share. IPMI was designed for full control, remote management, and monitoring, and it's pretty damn good at it. Farmer tells you in several ways that that very fact is why you're a hosed. And that is one of my key points for today, that an advanced persistent threat, one that is difficult to discover, difficult to remove, and difficult to attribute, is easier in a low-end monoculture, easier in an environment where much of the computing is done by devices that are deaf and mute once installed, or where those devices operate at the very bottom of the software stack with nothing underneath them, where those devices bring no relevant societal risk by their onesies and twosies, but do bring relevant societal risk at today's extant scales, much less the scales coming soon. Some of you might know Dave Eitel of Immunity Inc. As Dave Eitel has put many, many times, for the exploit writer, The hardest part by far is test, not coding. Put differently, over the years, I've modified my own thinking on monoculture so that I now view monoculture not as an initiator of attack, but as a potentiator, not as an oncogene, but as angiogenesis. 15 years ago, Laszlo Barabasi argued why it is not possible to design a network that is at once proof against both random faults and targeted faults, assuming that his conception of a scale-free network is good enough for our planning purposes. We see today that we have a network that is pretty well immune from failure from random faults, but which is hardly immune to targeted faults. 10 years ago, Sean Gorman at GMU did simulations, and they showed a sharp increase in network-wide susceptibility to cascade failure when a single exploitable flaw reached 43% prevalence. We are way above 43% threshold in many, many areas, most of them built in, unseen, and silent. 5 years ago, Kelly Ziegler of NERC calculated that patching a fully deployed smart grid would take an entire year to complete, largely because of the size of the per node firmware relative to the available power line bandwidth. How might we extrapolate from these various researchers' findings? The root source of risk is dependence, especially dependence on the expectation of stable system state. Dependence is not only individual, but mutual. Not only am I dependent or not, but rather a continuous scale asking whether we are dependent or not. We are, and it is called interdependence. Interdependence is transitive. Hence, the risk that flows from interdependence is itself transitive, i.e., if you depend on the digital world and I depend on you, then I too am at risk from failures in the digital world. If individual dependencies were only static, they would be invaluable. But we regularly and quickly expand our dependence on new things, and that added dependence matters because we each and severally add risk to our portfolio by way of dependence on things for which their very newness makes risk estimation and thus risk management neither predictable nor perhaps even estimable. Interdependence within society is today absolutely centered on the internet beyond all other dependencies except climate. And the internet has a time constant 5 orders of magnitude smaller. The Gordian knot of these trade-offs, our trade-offs, is this. As society becomes more technologic, even the mundane comes to depend on distant digital perfection. Our food pipeline contains less than a week's supply, just to take an example, and that pipeline depends on digital services for everything from GPS-driven tractors to drone-surveilled irrigators to robot vegetable sorting machinery to coast-to-coast logistics to RFID-tagged livestock. It is all the technologic dependency and the data that fuels it making us more resilient or more fragile. Does it matter that expansion of dependence is where legacy comes from? Is it essential to retain manual means for doing things so that we don't have to reinvent them under time pressure? Micha Kolcek from Croatia suggests that the way to think about the execution space on the web today is that the client has become the server's server. You are expected to intake what amount to remote procedure calls from everywhere and everyone. You are supposed to believe that trust is transitive but risk is not. That is what JavaScript does. That is what Flash does. That is what HTML5 does. That is what every embedded browser help object does. How do you think that embedded devices work? As someone who refuses JavaScript, I can tell you that the World Wide Web is rapidly shrinking because I choose not to be the server's server, because I choose not to accept remote procedure calls. As they say on Marketplace, let's do the numbers. The HTTP archive says that the average web page today makes out references to 16 different domains, as well as making 17 JavaScript requests per page. And the JavaScript byte count is 5 times the HTML byte count. A lot of that JavaScript is about analytics, which is to say data collection in the form of surveillance of the user experience. And we're not even talking about getting your visitors to unknowingly mine Bitcoin for you by adding that JavaScript to your website. Look it up. If I was going to run, never mind. To return to the question of whether immortal embedded systems are angelic or demonic, I ask you the most fundamental design question. Should or should not an embedded system have a remote management interface? If it does not, then a late discovered flaw cannot be fixed without visiting all the embedded systems, which is likely to be infeasible because some will be where you cannot go, some you will be unable to find, and there'll be rather a lot of them in any case. If it does have a remote management interface, the opponent of skill will focus on that, and once a break is achieved, will use those self-same management functions to ensure that not only does he retain control over the long interval, but as well, you will be unlikely to know that he is there. Stuxnet is just an example. Perhaps what is needed is for embedded systems to be more like humans, and I most assuredly do not mean artificially intelligent. By more like humans, I mean this. Embedded systems, if having no remote management interface, and thus out of reach, are a life form. And as the purpose of life is to end, an embedded system without a remote management interface must be so designed as to be certain to die no later than some fixed time. Conversely, an embedded system with a remote management interface must be sufficiently self-protecting that it is capable of refusing a command. Inevitable death and purposive resistance are two aspects of the human condition that I think we need to replicate, not somehow to imagine that overcoming them improves our future. That is perhaps the core of my thesis, that when sentience is available, automation will increase risk, whereas when sentience is not available, automation can decrease risk. Note the parsing, that replacing sentience with something that is not sentient will increase risk, but that substituting automation for whatever you have absent sentience can make things better. It won't do so necessarily, but it can. This devolves to a question of what do I actually mean when I say sentience is available? And that devolves to some combination of finance and public policy, which is to say, the art of the possible, both economically and politically. The future, obviously enough, will not be so simple, nor am I making it out to be. Lest some of you think this is all so much picayune, tendentious, academic, perfectionist posturing, here's how to deny the internet to a large fraction of its users. There are better methods, there are more insidious methods, there are darker paths. My apologies to those of you who are aware of what I'm about to describe, but this one example of many is known to several of us, known in the here and now. Home routers have drivers and operating systems that are binary blobs amounting to snapshots of the state of Linux plus the lowest end commodity chips that were extant at the time of the router's design. Linux has moved on. Device drivers have moved on. Samba has moved on. Chipsets have moved on. But what is sold at Best Buy or the like is remarkably cheap and remarkably old. At the chip level, there are only 3 major manufacturers, so Gorman's 43% threshold is surpassed. With certainty born of long engineering experience, I assert that those manufacturers can no longer build their deployed software blobs from source. If, as my colleague Jim Geddes has laboriously measured, the average age of the code base on those ubiquitous low-end routers is 4 to 5 years, then you can be assured that the CVE catalog lists numerous methods of attacking them, both the operating systems and the device drivers, and to do so remotely. If I can commandeer them remotely, then I can build a botnet that is on the outside of the home network. It need not ever put a single packet through the firewall. It need never be detectable by any means whatsoever from the interior of the network it serves, but it is most assuredly a latent weapon, one that can be staged to whatever level of prevalence I desire before I ask it to do more. All I need is to include in my exploit a way to signal that device to do 3 things. stop processing anything it henceforth receives, start flooding the network with a broadcast signal that causes other peers to do the same, and zero the onboard firmware, thus preventing reboot for all time. Now, the only way to recover is to unplug all the devices, throw them in the dumpster, and install new ones. But aren't the new ones likely to have the same kind of vulnerability spectrum and CVE that made this possible in the first place? Of course they do. So this is not a quick trip to the big box store, but rather flushing the entire design space and pipeline inventory of every maker of home routers. Now, about now, you will probably ask if it isn't a contradiction to imagine embedded devices that have no management interface for you, but are somehow something that can be managed by various clowns somewhere else. The answer is no, it is not a contradiction. As everyone here knows, the essential part of software analysis is fuzzing, piping unusual input to the program for the purpose of testing. But that is only testing. I refer you instead to the very important work now appearing under the title Language Theoretic Security, or LangSec. Let me quote just 2 paragraphs after I have a drink of water. The language theoretic approach regards the internet and security epidemic as a consequence of ad hoc programming of input handling at all layers of network stacks and in other kinds of software stacks. LangSec posits that the only path to trustworthy software that takes untrusted inputs is treating all valid or expected inputs as a formal language, and the respective input handling routines as a recognizer for that language. The recognition must be feasible, and the recognizer must match the language in required computing power. When input handling is done in an ad hoc way, the de facto recognizer, that is to say, the input recognition and validation code, ends up scattered throughout the program, does not match the programmer's assumptions about safety and validity of data, and thus provides ample opportunities for exploitation. Moreover, for complex input languages, the problem of full recognition of valid and expected inputs may be, in the formal sense, undecidable, in which case no amount of input checking or testing will suffice to secure the program. Many popular protocols and formats fell into this trap, the empirical fact with which security practitioners are all too familiar. That's the end of the quotation. And that is really and truly the point. The so-called weird machines that result from maliciously well-chosen input are the machines where, regardless of whether there is a management interface as such, they allow the target to be controlled by an attacker. The Dartmouth group has shown numerous examples of such weird machines in practice, including a 2013 Usenix paper which begins, a quotation, "We demonstrate a Turing-complete execution environment driven solely by the IA32 architecture's interrupt handling and memory translation tables, in which the processor is trapped in a series of page faults and double faults without ever successfully dispatching any instructions. The hardwired logic of handling those faults is used to perform arithmetic and logic primitives, as well as memory reads and writes. This mechanism can also perform branches and loops. No distribution, no way in which that isn't a weird machine, no way in which that doesn't tell you what the limit of what can be done is. And a Turing-complete execution environment based on interrupt handling. Therefore, we now see that devices that have no management interface cannot be repaired by their makers, but they can be commandeered by others if enough skill is brought to bear. Devices that do have a management interface are better off, but only if they protect that interface at all costs. Because the near entirety of internet usage, other than HTML4, relies upon Turing-complete languages, the security of these services cannot and never will be proven, because to do so is to solve the halting problem. When weird machine-style attacks begin to involve devices that do not have a human user who might be coherent enough to notice that something is amiss, they will proceed in stealth. there's not even a guarantee that their maker knows with precision what went into any one of them after the model year is over. The longer lived these devices really are, the surer it will be that they will be hijacked within their lifetime. Their manufacturers may die before they do, a kind of unwanted legacy much akin to Superfund sites and space junk. BBC Science reporting has already had an article on this very topic. As Daniel Bilar, who's largely with Siege Technologies, showed in his analysis of Conficker, quote, attackers and defenders each present moving targets to the other. That is his way of saying that oscillating advantage is to be expected just as in nature's predator-prey dynamics or in game theory. Why is that? Because a sentient opponent does whatever he can to exploit your code by way of exploiting the assumptions on which your code is built. Sandy Clark at UPenn showed that if software security is your goal, then, quote, software reuse is more harmful to software security than beneficial. Why? Because a sentient opponent first has to learn how your code works, and you help him by reusing components. In short, is it time to give up on software security or to double down the way the Langsep group shows us? Do we need more evidence than Langsec, than Bilar, than Clark give us with their collaborators? Is it time finally to accept Ken Thompson's seminal observation that you can only trust a program you wrote entirely and to act accordingly? Is it time to say that software per device has to be as unique as possible? To be brusquely clear, contemporaneously with writing this talk about the future, I read a scientific paper for a journal that talked exactly about that, about distributing software to endpoint devices based on diversity compiling on a onesies basis. At the same time, while I was writing, I also, I guess I have to say that the future may have appeared. We don't know, but the worm called the moon that is now working its way through the world's Linksys routers may be precisely what I described before. It may be that. It may not be that the forest might burn. It may be that it is already afire. It may be that we are one event away from being unable to disambiguate hostile action from an industrial accident. And that matters a lot, at least in Washington. I don't expect any of my analysis to change the course of the world, the market, or for that matter, to be heard on Capitol Hill. Therefore, let me give you my core prediction of advanced persistent threat. In a world of rising interdependence, advanced persistent threat will not be about the big-ass machines. It will be about the little. It will not go against devices that have a host name and a console. It will go against the ones you didn't even know about. It will not be something that you can fix in any of the usual senses of the English word fix. It will be avoidable only by damping dependence. It cannot and will not be damped by some laying on of supply chain regulations. You are Gulliver, they are the Lilliputians. My personal definition of a state of security is the absence of unmitigatable surprise. My personal choice for the pinnacle goal of security engineering is no silent failure. You, for all values of you, need not adopt those. But I rather imagine you will find that in an internet of things, more things than you can imagine, an ounce of prevention will be worth way more than a pound of cure. That does, in fact, impact everything. We have very little time left. The low-end machines of 4 years from now are being deployed today. We have to get a handle on this, particularly if, as I said at the outset, we are at the knee of a curve that we can barely discern but will appear obvious in retrospect. Omar Khayyam said this 1,000 years ago, and you'll recognize it. The moving finger writes, and having writ moves on, nor all thy piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all thy tears wash out a word of it. You know, there's never enough time. Thank you for yours.
Dan, Dan was like, I'm gonna go big, and he definitely went big. Do you have like a couple minutes? I would guess there are probably some questions in the audience for our keynote speaker.
I usually don't, but I'm happy to do that. Whatever, you're the MC, whatever you want to do.
Okay. Are there questions? Okay.
What kind of router do you use at home?
I run OpenWrt. Open WRT. I recommend it.
It's an important one. Any other questions for Dan?
Of course, at the same time, I have one of the $10 Tenda ones where we run a business, and people who say, don't you have any wireless I can use? They get to use that one. If that makes me mean, you heard it here. Anyway, yes.
So, Dan, you predicted that there might be an increase in vulnerabilities reported for SOHO routers in CVE, and it's already happening. We're seeing an increase, and it's really, really obvious basic stuff. It's already happening.
And is the pipeline full of things that are similar?
Yes.
Okay. I did not plant this. I will say that.
There's no change of money here.
No, exactly. And what would be your, in so many words, assumption here? Is it a failure of execution, or is it worse? Is it intentional, in other words? You know, that old bit about never ascribe to treachery,
I think that old saying still applies.
Okay.
I know SANS, I think, did a little sandbox test or a little honeypot test over the weekend with a home router, or last week, or the home router that kind of hung it out there and see how long it took. And
when I mentioned the moon, which is a worm that's moving through, there is also the possibility that malware against that has appeared. Because as everybody here knows, when somebody figures out how to do something, somebody else says, thank you for doing that for me, I will follow you. Number one. Number two, there appears to be a banking fraud underway in Brazil that might be related.
So let's take this a bit further. You know, you're talking about routers, we're talking about mobile devices. How about home automation? Refrigerators or Nest devices that have embedded microphones. We now have internet-connected devices which can be compromised into surveillance.
Yes, and yes, this is all true. I was saying to a couple of my colleagues here at the break, there's a lovely little paper look up. It's called Place Radar. Like it sounds, Place Radar. And the idea is that if I walk in with a smartphone camera, put it in my pocket, I now have a 3D image of everything in the room, because with enough math, that's possible. And so the argument is, if there's any camera, it doesn't have to be me being obvious and waving, a smartphone around. If there's any camera, with enough math, you can reconstruct space. And you can do that with numerous cameras. I mean, I'm trying to think of the name of the company. There's a company that is selling LED replacements for lighting systems in large venues. I believe they actually did the Moscone in San Francisco, which is only amusing because that's where RSA was held, right? But along with the lighting devices comes as options, cameras, microphones, sensors of various sorts, IPv4v6 with or without permanent address, and so forth. You can do a lot of things with that. And in fact, if, as I said, just this one little, it just was an academic paper, I like little academic papers, but with one little camera just waving it around, you can reconstruct. If you have a dozen of them, I mean, let's pick on this room, there are at least how many top hats in here? Like 25 top hat lights. You don't need anything else. I mean, and how will you find that? I used to be on a mailing list for people who, quote, debugged, and by that I mean swept a conference room for listening devices. I don't know, that mailing list has gone silent, and I wonder if that's because it just can't be done.
Well, James Atkinson got silent.
Well, yes, he got silent. That might be it. On the other hand, if you haven't been in a SCIF lately, they still enforce the, no electronic devices whatsoever, a secure communication facility. I don't know where that goes, but it's embedded now in everything, and it's cheap. It's drastically cheap. In my day job, I've seen camera lenses that can be focused electrostatically. There's no moving parts. You put a little voltage across it and it changes the zoom. And they're tiny. And they would be in your camera today, except that the people who make the cell phones are so cheap that the 3-cent upgrade cost is one that they're not prepared to pay yet. But it'll come. It'll come. You know, when you start making movies, you do want to zoom, right? You know, the miniaturization thing, as you suggest, is everywhere. I mean, how many exploits are there against printers? You know, just as a trivial example. Sure, print every document. I'd like a copy, thank you. You know, who would notice? Who would notice?
So you talk about the threat against digital technologies, but there's a threat against other types of infrastructure and functionality that's in the marketplace. What do you predict on that? Natural gas. I was talking to one gentleman earlier that I'm working with one company that was trying to detect that their fuel cell gas the cartridges that they were using were manufactured at an appropriate lab that was supplied by them, because if they got inappropriate materials pumped into this device, it now becomes more of a lethal weapon than it is not. So how do we extend that? Is there any sort of mechanism?
I would guess that we can sense a lot of things. You know, and that included, as you probably know, DNA analysis is down to under 24 hours, under $1,000. So that's forensics.
Right.
But I'm saying that sensors, generally speaking, I was using DNA as perhaps the hard problem.
Okay.
You know, that end of the scale. But so the question is, can you believe the sensor? And that's the hard problem.
Yep.
I mean, Stuxnet was all about that.
Sure.
Sensor said spinning just fine when it's like whatever it is, 30% over limit. And of course, the really skilled person doesn't make it blow up right away. They make it do something that looks like failure. Looks like failure. There's a great talk given by, I can't remember his name, I'm sorry. He's the head of the Boston Water Sewer Commission. And in turn, he is the head of the water ISAC, ISAC, if that means anything to y'all. But he talks about how water systems are completely unprotectable. And it's 100% analog. Anybody can go to Home Depot, buy a power washer, hook it up in reverse, and put anything in the system they want. And there's nothing to prevent it. Nothing whatsoever. And there's no way to tell that it's going on. And there's enough abandoned houses you don't even need to do it at home. And he gives a wonderful talk about this. In so many words, there's no hope of this, so what do they do instead? And the answer is they do, and I didn't mention this today, one of the arguments that you can make, it's sort of like the availability calculus. You can either say mean time between failures is infinite, and you work toward that, or you can say mean time to repair is 0, and work toward that. And as far as I know, the water people are trying to figure out, whenever they discover something, how quickly can they contain it? And that might be where we have to go. You know, one could argue, I think pretty effectively, that either we take a break right now and redesign a lot of things, or we say that the nature of liability has got to change and let, in some sense, the market take care of that, although it will take a while, and now you're relying on the trial lawyers. I will not go there. Or you say that fast recovery is the issue. And fast recovery might well be the issue. And you know, in a hospital operating room, electric power is on the fast recovery model. We do everything we can not to have the lights go out, but if they go out, it'll just be a flicker and nothing really happens. Maybe that's what we need. Maybe we need the fast recovery. But I'm suspecting that for small devices, it is quite likely that we will be heavy-tailed, that the distribution will be heavy in the tails for either it just doesn't fail or it recovers quickly. And the key to that is, can you believe the sensors? And I suspect that as a design problem, as a perhaps even a research problem, although I hope not, how to have sensor proof, how to have sensors that cannot be made to lie, or you can tell when they are. Back to my real point is no silent failure. I will assume that it will fail. Can I tell that it has? I don't know, I'm making this up as I go, talking to you, but that's what comes to mind.
What would be better is if it could tell that it failed itself.
Yes, yes. I mean, nonstop computing sort of solved that a long time ago. You do your calculations in quadruplicate, and they're compared in pairs, and if any pair doesn't match, and you don't go to the moon with one computer, you go with several, and so forth and so forth. It may well be that the Internet of Things ought to be thinking in terms of high levels of, quote, unnecessary, unquote, replication, so that single points of failure are obviated by deployment strategies rather than by design strategies. It might be that.
Based on a quorum.
Based on a quorum, right. And for what it's worth, split key crypto or threshold crypto is perfectly capable of doing quorum type calculations such that it says 3 of these have to agree, it doesn't matter which 3. And that's something that, if you want to talk sometime, I can talk about that. That's actually something I know something about.
So,
This will have to be the last question. Yeah, go ahead.
thank you. So, a lot of what's been talked about today is almost akin to boiling the ocean. Some of the threads that have come up is that a lot of this is a supply chain.
Did you say boiling the ocean?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
That's a segue from your.
Yeah, boiling the ocean's fine. Go ahead. Yeah.
So the question is you look at investments. So, are we talking about there's a lot of incremental changes that can come as a result of how we're doing things today, or there could be some disruptive set of technologies or products that could help move things along, and there's a lot of different use cases out there. If you were to look at this and say, as an investor, somebody coming through the door, if they had these set of capabilities or whatever, what would that look like? Do you think
I'd rather be doing that as the NSF rather than as National Science Foundation than as an investor. Because part of the investor problem is we're a little different, but your ordinary investor says, what's the chance of $1 in gets me 10 out within the lifetime of the fund from which I'm withdrawing the dollar? If that makes no sense, but you have a return requirement. In our case, I'll just be honest with you, what In-Q-Tel is measured in is the rate at which intelligence agencies adopt the products of companies we have invested in. So we're measured on adoptions. Now, for me, that means the intelligence community has to be interested in the problem. I brought them a way. Folks, I know some of you work for the press and so forth. I'd really rather you didn't put this in the newspaper. So I'll be a little vague, but I'd appreciate it.
Be very vague unless you want it in the newspaper.
Well,
there are no, you can't.
I know that. I know
You
that.
know the rules.
No offense, Boston College just showed that. And I know the head librarian,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
right. Well, let me put it this way. Suppose I could prevent modification of chip masks when I send them to Taiwan. I get them all the way I want them, and I send them, and I'm worried that something might happen. People who know what they're talking about tell me that you can have a kill switch in a network-capable device for maybe 3,000 gates, surely 3,000 gates, maybe as few as 1,000. You're talking about 20 million gates on the chip. How are you going to find it? You're not. Even if you have the patience of Job and an electron microscope, you're not going to find it. Suppose I had a technology that prevented the insertion of extra functionality after the chip mask was frozen. What would you do with that? And the question is, that would be mighty useful, wouldn't it? But who's going to invest in that? And I can only invest when I have a customer. And I will, as you can guess, I have not invested. Why? Because nobody wanted to attack the supply chain problem at that level. And it's a good argument that comes back, which is, no, what I want is a supply chain where the components I have leverage over at some other level, like they're big enough to sue, or we have treaties, or something that's of a different sort. Not that I can obviate it per se by a little technology from a company that was much smaller than the number of people in this room. Now, why did I bring that up? Because there was this wonderful line, which came back to me was, we don't do chips. And I said, well, chips do you. And I got stony silence. Who's the market is the question. Do you want does it have to be a mandated market, or can you make it attractive enough that it's not a mandated market? This goes back to the question of, do you throw liability in the mix or not? I don't know. I'd like to say that you have to throw liability in there, but on the other hand, that has an awful lot of side effects. An awful lot of side effects. It's the chemotherapy, if you will, of solving the problem.
Dan, thank you so much. Let's give a warm thank you to Dan.